Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm Nicole. I am the Vice President of White Hat, and I will be talking about Intro to Cryptography. So this will be super introduction. If you've taken 321, it'll probably be somewhat repetitive because a lot of the information is taken from Bruce DeBrule's 321 slides. If you didn't know, 321 is computer security. And if you want to know more about this subject, you can talk to me or any of the other lovely officers, or take Intro to Security or Cryptography, which is actually a class that's offered here, I believe, in spring. 321 is a prerequisite. Cool. So, agenda, what we're going to go over today. So first, a broad overview of cryptography. Next, the difference between encryption, hashing, and encoding. Then some historical cryptography, some modern cryptography, and some recommendations for what you should use out in the real world. Cool. So what is cryptography? It's this big fancy word that a lot of people use that some people don't know what it means. So this is the definition that I just got online, and it's practice and study of techniques for secure communication in the presence of third parties called adversaries. It's basically a way to hide data. Specifically, most modern cryptography uses very fancy math to hide data. Not going to get into most of the fancy math today because that's outside the scope of this talk, and I am not a mathematician nor a cryptographer. Yes. Cool. So, what are our goals for cryptography? Most of the time when we're doing cryptography, we have a few main goals in mind. The first one of which is what most people think of when they hear cryptography, which is confidentiality. That's hiding your data, making sure that people who aren't supposed to be seeing it aren't seeing it. And that's usually done through encryption, which is the actual hiding of the data. And then you got authentication, which is making sure that the data that you are receiving is coming from the source that you are expecting to receive it from. And this is mostly done through digital signatures, which are kind of outside of the scope of this talk. I'm mostly going to be talking about encryption. Also integrity, which is also somewhat outside the scope of this talk, which is ensuring that the data that you have gotten has not been tampered with. So that's usually achieved by hashing the thing and then sending that along with it, and then checking to make sure that the thing that got hashed hasn't been changed. And then we have Kerckhoffs Principle, which is basically some like overarching things for what we want to achieve with cryptography. So first, security should not depend on the system, only on the key. This is basically the idea that your cryptographic algorithm shouldn't have to be secret for your thing to remain secure. So just the key that you use to encrypt your data should be the important thing, not the algorithm itself. So like all the algorithms I'll be talking about, you can find all these resources online, you can figure out exactly how they work. But the really important thing is that you don't have the key to the thing, so you can't unencrypt it. You can't decrypt it. The system should be usable. This is a big issue with security, is the trade-off between usability and security. Usually the more secure something is, the less usable it is, because it makes it harder to do it, which also makes it harder for adversaries to try to crack it, but then that also makes it harder for normal users to use it. So cryptography should be usable. There's a few examples I have in here of when cryptography is great and awesome, but isn't usable. Keys must be easy to change. If some adversary finds your key, you should be able to just go in, change the key, and re-encrypt your system. This should be really easy to do, which is one of the main goals. Cool. So, quick aside, why do we care about cryptography? Why do we need to encrypt things? This goes into privacy, which is a whole nother concept, and you can take an entire class on this next quarter. But it's basically the idea that we have some stuff that we don't want other people to know, depending on so we have some stuff that maybe we don't want random people to know. We don't want attackers to know. We don't want the government to know. There's all of these different scopes of things that we want certain people to know. So everyone has sensitive information. Some people make the argument of, oh, I don't have anything to hide. I'm not doing anything malicious, but everyone has sensitive data. One of the cool arguments I like against this is, what if I asked you for your email and password? Would you just give that to me? Most of the time you don't want to share that kind of data. So this is why we have encryption, and this is why this is important. It's also, we don't want things spying on all of our stuff. Like ads can be very targeted because they get a lot of our data, and then the government also gets a lot of our data sometimes, which sometimes we don't like. And then there's also the issue of surveillance, which is pretty much, so even if you're not doing anything bad, people generally act differently when they know that someone is watching them. So we want to try to prevent this. And then to kind of sum up this brief aside privacy is this really cool Edward Snowden quote that I like, that is kind of overused, but makes a lot of sense when you read it and think about it. Cool. Okay, now using crypto. So when you're using crypto out in the real world, here are some do's and don'ts. Do understand the tools. Know what you're using, why you're using it, and how to use it. This is super important because if you implement cryptography wrong, it will not ensure you any security whatsoever. You need to be able to use the tools correctly to actually guarantee the privacy that you expect to have. Use tested and trusted implementations. There are a lot of really awesome security blogs that I can point you to that, and organizations that post about what the current encryption algorithms that we like to use nowadays are. And you should use those and not old ones. Or also new ones. You don't want to use the new fancy encryption algorithm that hasn't been tested yet because it's probably maybe broken. You want to wait for like the real security engineers to test out the algorithms before you start migrating your entire system over to them. And then some don'ts. Don't try to solve all security problems with this. Cryptography is good for hiding data, and it's good for exchanging data, and it's good for some other things, but it's not good for, say, protecting your website from cross-site scripting. I don't know how you would use cryptography for that, but some people try to. Also, don't use custom implementations. This one's a really important one. If you want to like write your own version of RSA, that's all well and good, but don't use it anywhere. Use it for like learning and learn the thing and then use libraries. Once again, don't roll your own crypto. This is real important. If you get one takeaway, this is the takeaway. Crypto's cool, use libraries. Okay, now attack model. When we're saying that we're protecting against attackers, what are we talking about? So the first one is an eavesdropper. This is just a passive person who is somehow getting the traffic between you and whatever web application or server that you're trying to talk to. This is a passive person, and what we mostly want to focus on for this is confidentiality. If we're encrypting the data, then they don't get any information from it, and that's good. We also have intercept, which is you have someone in the middle who is also just dropping the packets. So you're like sending the things, and then they're getting the thing and just not passing it along. So this is an issue of like what I talked earlier of also confidentiality, but it's also being able to actually access the server is the issue with intercept. And then man in the middle is the main one that most people hear about when they hear about cryptography and trying to access a server remotely in any way. And that's when someone gets the, intercepts the packets and changes them somehow and forwards them along. Or gets the packet, drops it, and then sends their own data. And then last one is imposter, which is when you pretend to be one of the endpoints, the user of the server itself. Cool. So what is the difference between encryption, hashing, and encoding? Encryption is hiding data. This is when you have some key that you're using to encrypt this data, and you only want the people with either that key or the corresponding key to be able to decrypt that data. So you don't want someone to be able to just look in and read it. And then we have hashing, which is actually different. And this is mostly used for integrity, not confidentiality. And this takes an arbitrary length input and generates some fixed length output. Most people see this from like hash tables from like 202. Secure actual cryptographic hashing is very different from just normal, you take a thing and then you hash it and then you use it to make a hash table. One of the key differences is that we want to try to minimize the number of collisions you have. Because if you have any collisions, actually, it makes it an insecure cryptographic hash algorithm, if you can find those collisions. And cryptographically secure hash functions have 4 main requirements, the first of which that the same input will always generate the same output, generally true of all hash algorithms. Second, multiple inputs should not hash to the same output. That's sometimes fine if you're doing a hash table, because then you can just do some kind of resolution for that, but is not fine for cryptography, because then you are not guaranteeing integrity because two different inputs could hash to the same output. Third, it should not be possible to go from the output to the input. So it shouldn't be some simple algorithm to get there. It should be complex enough and varied enough that if you have an output, you should not be able to figure out what the input was. Any modification of the input should drastically change the output. So if you change one bit in the input, the output should be completely disparate. It should not be anywhere similar. Last is encoding. Encoding guarantees no security and doesn't really change the data at all. It just changes the data format. So that's anything, so it ensures no secrecy, and the data, so any data that you put in will just be a different format coming out, still be able to be readable as long as you have a system that can read that format. Cool, that's one I just wanted to get into because that's a common interview question for some security interviews. Cool, how do we determine the security of cryptographic algorithms? Basically, yes? So encoding is like base64 encoding, which is like a way to convert just like a bit string into like some readable human format, which is just like, yeah. Yes?
You mentioned a bit a few times. What is a bit?
A bit is a 0 or a 1. It's what all computers are based off of. So yeah. Cool? Does that make sense? A bit has two states, either on or off. It can be a 0 or a 1, and you link them together to make words and programs and stuff. Cool, so security of cryptographic algorithms are determined by a few things. One, by patterns. You don't want your encrypted data to have any kind of pattern. We'll see a little about this later with some of the algorithms. And ideally, you want complete randomness. But as I'll show you later, that's not really feasible. So you just want to make it look as random as possible. Another issue is the key set. Ideally, if you have a cryptographic algorithm, you should have no patterns whatsoever. And to break the algorithm, you should have to brute force it, which means that you have to try every single possible key and just check to see if the output is the same as the output that you generated. And that should take forever. That should take a ridiculously long time, like it should take years. And that is dependent on the key set. So how many possible keys you can have for this algorithm determines how fast it would be to brute force the algorithm. And also another thing to take into account is computational feasibility. We don't want to make a cryptographic algorithm that is perfectly secure that you just cannot use, that takes like days to actually encrypt a thing, or even like hours to encrypt a thing. You don't want something that takes so long that you just can't use it in everyday life, because that defeats the purpose. Cool. So now I'm going to talk about one-time pad. And this is basically like the gold standard of like if we could use any cryptography with like, if we could use cryptography with and not have to worry about computational feasibility at all, this would be perfect, because it ensures perfect secrecy. Because it's basically, you take your message, you generate a string of random bits as long as the message, and then you XOR the two things together. And XOR is this little symbol here, the little plus with the circle around it, and that basically means if the bits are the same, so if you have a 0 or a 0, or the bits are the same and it's a 1 and a 1, then you get a 0, but if they're different, then you get a 1. And this means that if you XOR the two things together, it is equally likely that in your original message, you had a 1 as you had a 0. Because your random thing could have been a 1 or a 0. And for whatever output it is, it's, yeah. So this is awesome, except that it's not computationally feasible, so we don't really actually use it. It's not really used anywhere except like possibly for like a secure phone line between Russia and the US, but that's like maybe an urban legend, we're not really sure. There's also a problem with reuse. If you ever reuse a key for this, you basically break the encryption, because the way that XOR works is if you XOR two things together. So if you XOR your original message with the key and then XOR a different message with the key and then XOR those two things together, the keys will cancel out because of the properties of XOR, and you will get your original message XORed with your second message, which is not super secure. That's just two regular messages XORed together. Cool, so some historical ciphers just for some background. So first we have the Caesar cipher, which is just a basic shift cipher of you take every letter in the English language and you just shift it over by a certain number. And so if you were like, I think that, so if you were shifting by like 3, then your A would become D and your B would become E and so on and so forth, and then you would just wrap at the end of the alphabet. And the problem with Caesar ciphers are they're not random. The output is not really random at all, and they're super easy to brute force because there are only 26 possible keys because of the way that it wraps around. If you have the key of 0 and you have the key of 26, those are the same key. And so you can literally just spit out all 26 possible outputs and see which one looks like plain text. Then you have another one that's slightly better called the Monoalphabetic Cipher, which is you map every single letter in the English language, and these are just simple ciphers for like words and letters. And you map every letter to another letter in the English language. And this is like slightly better because there's not just 26 possible keys. There's actually 26 factorial possible keys, which is like a decent amount of keys, except that it's still really easy to brute force with some simple optimizations, which is you can do a letter frequency count and whatever, and map that to known frequencies of the English language. And as long as it's not some like really weird piece of text, that will generally give you some information that will make it easier to brute force. Cool, now a little bit into modern crypto. So there's two main types of cryptography we use, which are symmetric encryption and asymmetric or public key encryption. And so symmetric encryption, you use the same key to encrypt and decrypt. And asymmetric encryption, you use two different keys. You use one public key to encrypt and one private key to decrypt. And I'll go into detail about more of these. So symmetric encryption, what do we use it for? We use it for secure storage on device and in the cloud, and also communication. It's really good for secure storage. One problem with using it for communication is that you have to share the key, and that's a whole other issue that I will also go into later with a cool key exchange algorithm. There's two types of symmetric encryption. There are block ciphers and stream ciphers. I'm going to talk about block ciphers, but I'm not going to talk about stream ciphers because they're a little less relevant. And so block ciphers I'm going to talk about, which is where you split your, so that's when you have to know the size of the data that you want to be encrypting, because you split that into blocks of a certain size and then encrypt each block separately. Cool, this is a super, not basic, but this is an old block cipher that we used, which is called DES, which stands for Data Encryption Standard. It's an old symmetric block encryption from the 1970s. We don't use it anymore because it's very broken. So full DES has 56-bit keys and 64-bit messages, which is breakable within days for modern computing, and that's not really what you want. So it gives 2 to the 56th complexity, which means that that's your key space, if you could have 2 to the 56th possible keys. And one problem with that is it's not super secure. So we tried to fix that by doing double DES, which is you take something that is encrypted with DES and just encrypt it with DES again with a different key, which should give you 2 to the 1/12th complexity, because it should be 2 to the 56 times 2 to the 56. Because you're encrypting it twice with different keys. But the problem with that is this cool thing called a meet in the middle attack. And that's when you go from both ends of, so the general way that you brute force things, and you just make a dictionary of inputs to outputs and then see which of the outputs looks like your right thing. But this one you do every possible plain text dictionary to every possible first ciphertext, and then every possible second ciphertext mapped to every possible first ciphertext backwards, decrypting with all of the guesses for your second key. And then just see where those overlap. And then you will get the first key and the second key in only 2 times 2 to the 56th, which is 2 to the 57th, which is barely more secure than just normal DES. So then they tried to fix this with triple des, which fixes that and makes it actually 2 to the 1/12 complexity. But that's also bad because it's just really slow. And it's still not super fantastic. There's other problems with it that I'm not going to get into. So what do we actually use? We use AES. That's the Advanced Encryption Standard. This is what is used modern day in pretty much all systems. If systems are still using DES, that's really sad. And so the really cool thing about AES is it's faster than DES, especially faster than triple DES. And there are multiple possible key lengths. So depending on how secure you want your system to be, how possible you want it to be brute forced, you can change the key length that you use to encrypt your things. And I'll get into what kind of key lengths you should use for systems a little bit later. Next, block ciphers are cool, but you can't just encrypt the entire thing with the algorithm. You have to split it up into blocks and then encrypt that block and then encrypt the next block and encrypt the next block. And there's different ways to go about this. And so the goals we want for this is no information leakage. You don't want to be able to look at the ciphertext and determine anything about the plaintext. And you should not be able to change the ciphertext and knowingly also change something in the plaintext. So if you change like a few bits in the ciphertext, you shouldn't know what that's going to do to the plaintext. I should also be able to be parallelized. This is really important for especially modern computers with GPUs, because if you can parallelize things, it gets way faster. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. I'm going kind of fast. Any questions so far? Everything sound good? Feel free to stop me at any point with questions. Cool. So what are some modes of operation? So the first mode of operation, which is just super simple, is called ECB, which is electronic codebook. And that's basically you just take every single block and you just encrypt it with your algorithm with the same key for every block. And that's what this cute little penguin here is from. That is using ECB encryption on, does anyone know what that image is? Yeah, so that's the Linux penguin. But you can still tell it's the Linux penguin, even though it is encrypted. And that's because ECB is horrible at leaking information. Because if you have the same block of the same thing, so if you have like a block of like a certain number of pixels and it's all white, and then you have a block of another number of pixels and it's all white, then they encrypt to the exact same thing. So it leaks a ton of information about patterns. And so this is bad. We don't use it. Please don't use it. So we also have CBC, which is cipher block chaining. And this is a lot more secure, and this is a lot better. And this is because your first block of plaintext is XORed with some known, some like free, some initialization vector, which is that IV right there. And that does not have to be secret. So you XOR those two things, and then you encrypt that, and you generate your first block of ciphertext. And then you take that first block of ciphertext, and you XOR that with your plaintext, and then you encrypt that. And so on and so forth until you get your entire string of ciphertext. This is great. Less information leakage, still sometimes information leakage if you have a really big set of data. And one problem with this, though, is it's vulnerable to ciphertext manipulation, because if you change a bit in one of these cipher blocks, then when you're decrypting it, it changes that corresponding bit in one of the plaintext blocks, which is a kind of hard attack to actually execute in the wild sometimes, but like that's one of the problems with this algorithm. Cool, so now moving into public key crypto. So public key crypto, like I said before, is when you have two different keys for encryption and decryption. And one of the cool things that we can do with public key crypto is actually exchange keys so that we can use symmetric key crypto, symmetric key encryption. And this is done through the Diffie-Hellman key exchange algorithm, which is this algorithm that was come up with by some very smart people about how to exchange keys. And I'll go into that later. And then And also, if we don't want to do that, if we don't want to exchange keys, the solution to this is public-private key pairs. And this is basically you use some fancy math to ensure that if you encrypt with this one public key that you can just leave out in the open, you can decrypt with this other private key. And that takes advantage of these things called one-way functions, which are functions that are really easy to do in one direction, but really hard to do in the other direction. So when you let your public key out in the wild, they can't then take that public key and figure out what your original private key was that goes along with that. Cool, so what is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange algorithm? So basically, it's a pretty simple algorithm of both sides choose a random number, and they have some shared generators, P and G, and then they generate a shared secret. And the way they do that is they use their private key, which is that random number they generated. They do some modifications of the generators with their key, send that over to the other person, and then do the same, and do some modifications again with their private key, and then through the way that exponentiation and modular arithmetic works, they end up with the same shared secret. And so this way, they have the same key and can then send encrypted messages to each other. The problem with this is Charlie down here doesn't know their shared secret, but if Charlie is man in the middling these two people, he can just intercept what they're trying to send to each other and instead send along his own generated public key from his own random number, and then do the exchange that way, and then he has shared private keys with both Alice and Bob and can then decrypt their data, encrypt whatever he wants, and send that on to the other person. So this doesn't really guarantee any integrity, it just guarantees confidentiality as long as you know that the person that you're actually exchanging the key with is the person you think they are. Okay, now moving on to how we actually do public key crypto nowadays. This is RSA, and this is pretty much the standard algorithm. It uses some fancy modular arithmetic and factoring problem that I'm not really going to get into. But it's basically use that to generate your public-private key pair, and you can just publish your public key out into the world, and anyone can encrypt with that public key, send you the ciphertext, and you can decrypt with your private key. And so as long as your private key never gets shared, this algorithm ensures security between the other person and you. This can also be used for signing, because you can sign with your private key, and then the other person can you can sign with your private key, and then the other person can verify that with your public key. And if you want to learn more about RSA, specifically how it works, you can talk to me. I'm definitely not an expert. You can also talk to some of our lovely security professors because they know a lot more about it. There's also some really cool resources online that I can also point you to because it's a cool algorithm. Cool. And now any questions before I move on to my final point about recommendations? Cool. So recommendations. These are not my recommendation. These come from NIST and OWASP, which are trusted security sources. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. And so everything up until now is the background that you needed to be able to make your own decisions about what kind of cryptographic algorithms to use. So for symmetric key encryption, what do we want to use? We want to use AES. Never use it with the mode of operation ECB, that is not secure. Use it with CBC instead, which is cipher blockchaining, which is where the things are actually XOR together, so you get rid of that most of that pattern problem. And something I didn't really talk about a ton but want to mention is if you're encrypting bit streams, you want to use output feedback mode, which is a stream cipher that I didn't really go into because I didn't talk about stream ciphers. And if you have high-speed bit streams, you want to use counter mode, which I also did not go into, but that one's cool because you just have a counter and each block is encrypted with the next step in that counter. Yes, and so for most standard apps, you can use this with 128-bit keys, which is the standard for SSL, and that's going to guarantee you enough security. If you want to be super, super secure, you can use 256-bit keys, which you probably want to use for more secure applications like banking and stuff. And another thing I didn't go into a ton about authentication is you don't just want to encrypt your things, you also want to make sure that all of your things are authenticated. And that's done by using this thing called MAC, which is the message authentication code, which I didn't go over, but is how you ensure that your ciphertext and your message has not been tampered with. And a key point for that is you always want to encrypt your thing and then MAC it, and then generate the message authentication code. And for public key crypto, we want to use RSA. NIST's general recommendations for this are for legacy systems. You want to use 1024-bit RSA. Anything modern day, you want to use 2048-bit. And anything that will be like good way into the future, unless they just break RSA, is 3072-bit. Another interesting thing to think about for cryptography is this all works well and good for now, but quantum computing is kind of on the horizon and people think that's going to happen. And that would break a lot of our cryptographic systems because a lot of these solutions are based off of the problem of factoring is really hard and it's hard to do. But if we had quantum computing, it would be way easier to do. And so trying to crack keys would be a lot easier. And then another thing that I didn't go into too much, but is also important to know, is which hash algorithms to use. For hashing, you generally want to use something from the SHA-2 family. So something like SHA-256 or SHA-512 are good ones to use. SHA-3 is also, I think, good, but it's a little bit newer, so it's less tested, and it's pretty safe to just use SHA-2. And for hashing, don't use MD5, SHA-0, or SHA-1 because they're all broken. SHA-1 is not as broken, but there's problems with the algorithm, and Google has shown some collisions with it, maybe one collision with it, I think, and that's not great. Cool. So that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of information. Are there any questions? Yes?
So with that last slide,
yes.
Is there any reason why the future would be not the power of 2? It's like the other ones are all powers of 2.
Generally, the way you use, I don't think you need it. Is that not about? Yeah. So I don't think you need it to be. It just needs to be divisible by 128, I think. I think it makes the algorithm more efficient if you have a power of 2, but that number also works. Cool, yes, question.
So where would we be like using any of this crypto in our daily lives?
So if you're storing information, so there's a feature on your computer to encrypt your disk so that all of your data, you can't go in, grab the disk out of your computer, your hard drive or your SSD, grab that out of your computer and then just read all of the data off of that. It's also encryption in the cloud so that you can't have the cloud the company that does the cloud hosting for you read your data. Also sending any information over the web, you can encrypt that and send it to people. There's a lot of stuff about that to using like GPG that I didn't go into. And then also for any secure, like websites, like when you see HTTPS, that means that your data is being encrypted as it is sent across the interweb. And yeah, all sorts of applications like that. And if you want to have a server, you want to use encryption for that too. Any kind of website. Yes?
So So you mentioned that we should never roll our own crypto and
Yes.
use it. You said that we should use libraries. Do you have any libraries that you recommend for doing cryptography?
The only one that I have personally worked with is PyCrypto, which is good for if you're experimenting with cryptography using Python. So I did some cool stuff with RSA for that and AES, and yes. In terms of actually implementing cryptography for like a web application, not 100% sure. I can find some resources for you though, or point you to some places online. Yeah.
I was just wondering about what really is a public key and a private key, and what does it mean to like put a key out into the wild?
So it's literally just a string of bits. So it's just like a number that you put out into the wild. So it's like when I say like, so like with this, when I say 2048-bit keys, it's just a string of bits that has some property guaranteed by fancy mathematical formulas that if you take this string of bits, use it as the key with this algorithm. And so you have the algorithm and you have some plain text and you input the plain text and the key, it'll spit you out some ciphertext. And then you can then take that ciphertext, put it into, it's the like partner algorithm. So you have like the algorithm that encrypts the thing and then the algorithm that decrypts the thing. So the decryption algorithm with your private key, and then it'll spit you out the original plain text. And so what a literal key is it's just a string of bits. So it'll just be like, if you look at it in like hex format, it'll just be like 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 blah. Yep. Yes?
If I had a way and means of changing my password multiple times throughout the day, would DES still be effective for me?
I'm not actually sure. I'm not sure how fast that actually is. I think DES is also broken for other reasons besides that it's the key space is too small that it's easy to brute force. But possibly. Generally, we don't want to need to do that though. Yeah. Yes.
Would I be using DES on a password?
Wait, what was the question again?
I might be mixing some things up. Give me a minute.
Actually, wait. Speaking of DES,
Sure.
can you go through that man in the middle attack again?
Meet in the middle attack?
Meet in the middle. Yes.
Sure.
Because that was the thing with. Oh wait, he's leaving. I mean,
Yes, what about this?
Oh, see, now that I'm looking at the slide, I've totally forgotten my question. Oh well. Probably not important. Carry on.
Cool. Any other questions? It's pretty much time anyways, so I'll let you get off to your lives.